6 and 6?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. And just to welcome Minister McEntee to the House and to join with others, Minister, in commending you and your steady and calm handling of so many media and debate times on this issue of Brexit, and also to commend your officials and indeed the Taoiseach. I think we have had a very cooperative and collaborative approach, I think, in both houses of the Oireachtas, and I think everybody has worked in a constructive fashion with the government on seeking a way through this disaster. And indeed, Brexit is a disaster. I think we're all agreed on that. A no-deal Brexit is a disaster compounded. It's a disaster squared. And unfortunately, it looks increasingly likely that that is what we're facing now. Others have pointed out how time moves on in politics. A week may be a long time, but 2 hours this morning was a long time. At 10 a.m. it seemed as if the new instrument, the joint instrument and the declaration might be enough to overturn that 230 vote majority against the withdrawal agreement on the previous occasion in Westminster. But of course, by 12 o'clock, the British Attorney-General, in his devastating final paragraph 19, and I've read his legal advice, his devastating final paragraph 19 appears to have scuppered it, and now we see the DUP has come out against, said they will vote against, not just abstain, and indeed the other hardline Tories. It's extraordinary because when one reads this short legal opinion, only 19 paragraphs, in fact, the other paragraphs in it seem to me, at any rate, to be leading to a different conclusion. Paragraph 14, for example, the British Attorney-General suggests the joint instrument and declaration provide a substantive and binding reinforcement of the legal rights available to the UK in the event that the EU were to fail in its duties of good faith and best endeavours. So I think there was an alternative reading, and paragraph 19 seems to me to sit oddly with the rest of the opinion. But in any case, that's done now, and certainly it's not the only piece of bad news, because, just again, within the last hour, Nissan has announced it will stop manufacturing a particular model of car in Sunderland, and we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that fallout from Brexit. So what next? And others have dwelt on this and just briefly to say the only positive one can draw from this is if the likely defeat of the withdrawal agreement tonight in Westminster, if indeed that vote goes ahead, the only positive might be that it could trigger instead a second referendum, a referendum in which Remain was one option and in which an orderly exit was the other. I think that's the only possible positive development. And of course there is a way to that through the Labour backbench MPs, Kyle and Wilson, and through their amendment, which they're putting forward, I think, next week, and I think that vote will still go ahead. But it's hard to see how they would get to a majority for that. And I'm struck that Theresa May has said she will put the vote on a no deal to the House of Commons tomorrow, but of course if the majority reject that, it means a majority have rejected everything put to them, but we haven't seen a majority for anything. And a majority may indeed vote for an extension to Article 50, but of course the other 27 need to sign up to that. I know the Taoiseach has been on his feet a few minutes ago in the Dáil saying that Ireland would not stand in the way of an extension if the UK does seek one, but clearly there would need to be a reason. The UK would need to give a reason in order to be seeking an extension with any real prospect of agreement from the other 26 member states. I see also some senior Tories suggesting the only outcome tonight likely is going to be a general election in Britain. Well, that would certainly be a reason to extend Article 50, and maybe at this point that is the best scenario for Ireland, but it's very difficult to see any positive way through, and one would have to agree with the analysis of 43 former British ambassadors speaking a month ago who talked about the fiasco of Brexit and the national crisis. And indeed, if a general election were called, it's not even clear what the manifesto of each of the two parties, the Labour and the Tories, would be. And I think, I speak as a Labour party member here, obviously, and certainly we have done all we can from the Labour side to seek to influence our colleagues in British Labour to take a clearer stance in support of Remain, and I would hope that might come through more clearly, I think, given recent developments, and certainly one would hope so. And there is a very powerful movement, of course, for a second referendum and a people's vote on a cross-party basis in Britain. So, as I say, that's really the only light possible to be seen currently. Just briefly to speak about the bill before us, which is a complex bill, which we all hope won't be needed, which Joan Burton and the Dáil talked about as a just-in-case bill, and which, of course, I will be supporting along with my Labour colleagues in a constructive spirit, as others have said. We recognise that this is necessary, and we hope that it won't be necessary to pass it, but we hope that it won't be necessary to implement it or to put it into force. Three issues of concern, however, just to mention those briefly. First, the constitutional issue that my colleague and Party Leader Deputy Howlin raised in the Dáil, concern in particular around Section 4 of the bill, and whether that overreaches the power of of delegation of legislation, whether indeed the bill purports to give ministers power effectively to amend primary legislation in a way that would be contrary to Article 15 of the Constitution and our case law on Laurentiu and the more recent case of Mulcreevy from 2004. We can tease that issue out, I think, at committee stage perhaps more effectively, but I know it's a matter that Deputy Howlin raised in the Dáil with concern that delegated legislation, that the power to delegate here is too broadly stated effectively, and that it would purport to replace the power to make primary legislation. And I know in your own speech, Minister, you've said that there will be secondary legislations currently in preparation, but I think we do need to just make sure that we don't fall foul of our own constitution in terms of how that secondary legislation is framed. Secondly, on tax arrangements, and again Deputy Howlin raised in the Dáil a question about Part 6 of the bill, and pointing out that it could, I'll just finish with this and one other short point, that it might appear to give preferential tax treatment to the UK, therefore in breach of our obligations under the GATS Treaty and the normal WTO rules. And again, we can raise that. I'll raise that again at committee stage. And finally, on immigration, how will Brexit impact on the rights of non-EEA family members of British citizens currently resident in Ireland? It's something that's been raised with me, may have been raised with other colleagues too, and I would again like to get clarification on that point, perhaps at committee stage. So just to reiterate, we hope this bill won't be necessary, but I will be supporting it reluctantly along with other colleagues on a cross-party basis in this House.